How does a man destined for the pulpit, a boy who translated the Iliad by the age of 11, become the most notorious libertine in history? The archives of the Venetian Inquisition hold a clue, a hastily scribbled denunciation accusing the young abbot Giacomo Casanova of practicing black magic, filed just 2 days before he vanished from the seminary. Was it a fabrication by a jealous rival, or a glimpse into a darkness he would soon unleash upon Europe? And more curiously, why did a detailed map of Venice's secret water routes, sketched in his unmistakable hand, appear in the possession of a French diplomat a full year before Paris would ever officially seek his services as a spy? The story of Casanova is not the one we think we know. It is not a romance. It is a manual for a life lived without rules, a chronicle of a war waged against destiny itself. Born in 1725 into the shimmering, decadent decay of the Republic of Venice, Giacomo was a sickly child, plagued by nosebleeds so severe that his grandmother, a woman rumored to be a witch, took him to a sorceress. The cure was a grotesque ritual of spells and ointments, but it worked. Or perhaps it simply planted a seed in the boy's mind that the world operates on 2 levels, the one seen by the masses and the secret one, governed by hidden knowledge and daring manipulation. Venice itself was his first teacher, a city of masks, where a pauper could look like a prince for a night, and a senator could slip into a brothel unnoticed. It taught him that identity was fluid, a costume to be changed at will. His intellect was undeniable. He devoured books on mathematics, law, medicine, and philosophy. His father, an actor, had died when he was young, and his mother, also an actress, was perpetually on tour. He was raised by the city, by tutors who saw his genius, and by the whispers of the canals. His clerical career began with promise. At 16, he was the young abbot Casanova, delivering sermons that captivated congregations with their wit and erudition. But the cassock was too tight a garment for his ambitions. It was a means to an end, a key to unlock the doors of the Venetian aristocracy. Behind those doors, he found a world far more intoxicating than scripture. He learned to play Pharaoh, a card game that was less about luck and more about reading the desperation in a man's eyes. He learned that a well-placed compliment to an aging matriarch was worth more than a dozen prayers. His first true scandal was not with a woman, but with the law. Accused of a petty debt, he was summoned by the formidable state inquisitors, the secret police of Venice. He saw in their cold eyes not justice, but a system of power. And he learned his most valuable lesson: the law is a cage for smaller animals. The larger ones simply learn to walk around it. His expulsion from the seminary was inevitable, a clash between his insatiable curiosity for life and the rigid dogma of the church. He was found with forbidden books caught in compromising situations. But it was not a defeat. It was a declaration of independence. He shed the black robes for the vibrant silks of a freelance adventurer. He played the violin in a theatre orchestra, a humbling experience that only fueled his desire to be the one commanding the stage, not stuck in the pit below. His first great conquest was not one of love, but of pure strategy. He ingratiated himself with the elderly Venetian senator Matteo Bragadin. One day, Bragadin suffered a stroke. While doctors prepared to bleed the old man to death, a standard practice of the time, Casanova intervened. Using his self-taught medical knowledge, he stopped the bleeding and saved the senator's life. Bragadin, convinced Casanova was an adept of secret sciences, adopted him as a son. Suddenly, Casanova had wealth, protection, and a title. He had not earned it through birthright, but had seized it with intellect and audacity. The kings of Europe played with toy soldiers on the map of the world, while Casanova played with kings using only a deck of cards and a single smile. With Bragadin's money, he lived like a prince. His affairs became legendary, but they were never simple seductions. Each was a campaign. He seduced the wife of a powerful merchant not just for pleasure, but to gain intelligence about her husband's shipping routes. He charmed the mistress of a foreign ambassador to learn the secrets discussed in her bedchamber. Every stolen kiss was a piece of a larger puzzle, a move in a game only he understood. He fought duels in the fog-shrouded alleys of the Rialto, not for honor, but to build a reputation for lethality. A man who is feared is a man who is left alone. What would you do with such a gift of persuasion? Build an empire or throw it all away for a single night of passion? But Venice, the city of masks, has eyes everywhere. The state inquisitors did not forget the arrogant young abbot. They watched his rise with suspicion, his dabbling in Kabbalah, his library of banned books, his suspiciously endless supply of money, his seduction of the city's elite. It all painted a picture of a dangerous subversive. A man without allegiance to God or the state was a threat to the very foundation of the Republic. The net began to close. One night in July of 1755, the dreaded knock came at his door. The agents of the Inquisition arrested him without charge, without explanation. They led him across the Bridge of Sighs to a prison from which no one had ever escaped. The Venetian gambit was over. He had played against the house, and the house had finally won. Or so it seemed. The whispers of his audacity, however, were already crossing the Alps, carried on the winds of rumor and intrigue, reaching the glittering, cynical salons of Paris. The salons of Paris were a world away from the damp dread of a Venetian prison. Here, power was not wielded by masked inquisitors in dark chambers, but by wits in powdered wigs and by women who could destroy a man's career with a single, cutting remark. Into this glittering arena, Casanova arrived not as a refugee, but as a phenomenon. His name had preceded him, the tale of his intellectual prowess and social daring, making him an object of intense curiosity. He possessed the three assets most valued in mid-18th century Paris: a mysterious past, boundless confidence, and the ability to entertain. He quickly found a patron in the Abbé de Bernis, a man of the church who was more a poet and politician than a priest, and who served as the French foreign minister. Through de Bernis, Casanova gained entry into the highest circles of society, including the court of King Louis XV and, more importantly, the private chambers of his powerful mistress, Madame de Pompadour. He understood that to conquer Paris, he had to conquer her. He did not approach her as a suitor. That would have been a fatal mistake. Instead, he presented himself as a financial wizard, a man of ideas. France's treasury was hemorrhaging money, drained by constant warfare. Casanova proposed a solution that was pure genius in its simplicity and psychological insight: a state lottery. Lotteries were not new, but Casanova's vision was. He designed it not as a tax, but as a form of public entertainment, a spectacle that sold hope to the masses. He knew that the dream of unearned wealth was a force more powerful than any army. He presented his detailed calculations and projections to the royal financiers, dazzling them with his command of numbers and his understanding of human greed. The lottery was approved, and it was a staggering success, pouring millions of livres into the king's coffers. Casanova, as its architect, became a rich man and a hero of the state. He didn't conquer cities with armies, but with whispers in the right boudoir and the turn of a lucky card. His newfound status made him an invaluable asset. The French government, impressed by his cunning and his network of contacts, began to use him for secret missions. He was sent to Dunkirk to inspect the French fleet and report back on its readiness for a potential invasion of England. He traveled to Amsterdam, the financial heart of Europe, on a mission to secure a loan for the French crown, a delicate task requiring him to outmaneuver the sharpest bankers in the world. He was a natural spy. He could adopt any persona, speak multiple languages flawlessly, and read a man's intentions in the flicker of an eye. He moved through the courts of Europe like a phantom, gathering intelligence, spreading disinformation, and manipulating events from the shadows. Yet this grand tour of deception was not without its perils. In Vienna, he clashed with rival adventurers and spies, each trying to unmask the other. In Prague, he found himself in a high-stakes card game against a general who suspected him of being more than he seemed. The duel that followed was fought not with swords but with bluffs and hidden aces, the loser facing financial ruin and political exposure. Could you risk everything for absolute freedom, knowing the end is loneliness? He lived in a state of constant performance, a whirlwind of balls, diplomatic meetings, and secret assignations. He consorted with luminaries like Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, engaging them in philosophical debates that sharpened his own cynical view of humanity. He saw society not as a structure of laws and morals, but as a chaotic theatre of desire and ambition. He was its ultimate actor, playing the roles of financier, diplomat, scholar, and lover with equal applauds. But the higher he climbed, the more precarious his position became. His success bred enemies. Courtiers, jealous of his influence, whispered poison into the king's ear. Financiers he had outsmarted plotted their revenge. And always, in the back of his mind, was the shadow of Venice. The inquisitors had a long memory and even longer arms. He knew his celebrity was a double-edged sword. It protected him, but it also made him a target. He had built a magnificent life, a palace of deception on a foundation of charm. But he was keenly aware that one wrong move, one slip of the mask, could bring it all crashing down. His hubris, however, was growing with every success. He began to believe he was untouchable, a master of a game of his own invention. It was this arrogance that would lead him to make his most reckless move, a return to the one city that had sworn to destroy him, believing he could outwit the Venetian Republic itself. The unforgiving gaze of the Serenissima was already turning back towards him, ready to reclaim its most famous and most hated son. His return to Venice was an act of supreme arrogance. He paraded through the city that had condemned him, believing his wealth and his French connections made him immune. He was wrong. The state inquisitors were an institution that prized memory and patience above all else. They saw not a French diplomat, but the escaped blasphemer, the sorcerer, the corrupter of Venetian morality. On the night of July 25th, 1755, they struck. He was arrested in his sleep, the warrant citing his heinous crimes against the state and the holy faith. He was given no trial, no chance to defend himself. He was taken directly to the Doge's palace and thrown into the most dreaded prison in all of Europe, the Piombi, the lead roofs. The prison was the attic of the palace, its cells situated directly under the vast lead roof. In the summer, it was a furnace, the lead plates absorbing the blistering sun until the air became unbreathable. In the winter, it was a frozen crypt, the cold seeping through the stone and into the very marrow of the prisoner's bones. It was considered utterly inescapable. The cells were made of thick, larch wood planks studded with iron. The guards were famously incorruptible. The prison's only exit led directly through the heart of the palace, past dozens of sentries. Escape was not a possibility. It was a fantasy. For the first few months, Casanova fell into a deep despair. He was tormented by giant rats, plagued by insects, and fed a diet of slop. He lost track of time, his brilliant mind turning in on itself in the crushing silence and solitude. He contemplated suicide, but Casanova was, above all else, a fighter. The despair slowly burned away, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. He would not die here. He would defy the Republic one more time. He began a war of intellect against his captors. He was not a prisoner. He was a field marshal, planning a campaign from a dungeon. His first weapon was observation. He studied the guards' routines, the angle of the sun through the single high window, the very structure of the cell itself. He needed a tool, something to break through the thick wooden walls. One day, during his brief walk in the prison yard, he found it, a long, pointed iron bolt left behind by workmen. He smuggled it back to his cell, hiding it inside a copy of a book he was allowed. This bolt became his lifeline, his sword. He began the Herculean task of digging. For hours every day, in the sweltering heat, he would lie on the floor, chipping away at the wooden planks beneath his bed. He worked in secret, covering his progress with his meager furniture. The physical labor was excruciating, but the mental strain was worse. Every footstep in the corridor, every unexpected visit from a guard, sent a jolt of terror through him. He had to conceal the noise, the wood dust, the sheer physical exertion. After months of relentless work, he broke through the floor. His joy was short-lived. He had tunneled not to freedom, but into the office of the Grand Inquisitor directly below. It was a dead end. His plan was ruined. At that moment of ultimate defeat, fate, or perhaps his sheer audacity, intervened. He was abruptly moved to a different, more spacious cell. His jailer, a man named Lorenzo, allowed him to take his books and furniture. Hidden within his armchair was the iron bolt. His secret weapon was still with him. In his new cell, he found a new ally, another prisoner, a renegade priest named Father Balbi, who was housed in the cell next to his. Casanova, using a smuggled piece of wire and a system of codes, began to communicate with him. He convinced the priest to join his escape plan. The new plan was even more daring. He would not go down, but up. He would tunnel through the ceiling of his cell, get onto the lead roof of the Doge's palace, find a way back into the palace through a window, and then simply walk out the front door. It was insane. It was brilliant. He passed the iron bolt to Father Balbi, who began to dig a hole in his own ceiling. The night of the escape was set for October 31st, 1756. A storm was predicted, its noise perfect to cover their movements. Under the roar of thunder and the lashing of rain, they broke through the last of the ceiling. Casanova, thin and weakened, but driven by pure adrenaline, pulled himself up. He then pulled Father Balbi through the hole. They were out. They stood on the lead roof of the Doge's palace, the heart of the Venetian Empire, with the storm raging around them. They were exposed, exhausted, and their journey had only just begun. The roof was a treacherous landscape of steep, slippery lead plates. For hours, they scrambled across the vast expanse, searching for a way down. Finally, they found an open dormer window. They lowered themselves inside, finding themselves in a dusty archive room. The door was locked. Using his iron bolt, Casanova forced it open. They were now inside the palace proper. They moved like ghosts through the opulent halls, their prison rags a stark contrast to the priceless art and gilded ceilings. They descended staircases, navigated corridors, their hearts pounding with every distant sound. Finally, they reached the main gate. They walked towards the final guard with an air of absolute confidence. The guard, seeing two men emerge from the palace interiors at dawn, assumed they were officials who had been locked in by accident. He unbolted the door and let them out. Giacomo Casanova and Father Balbi stepped out into the piazzetta, free. He had done the impossible. He had escaped the Piombi. The news of his escape spread like wildfire across Europe. It was not just the story of a man escaping a prison. It was a mythic act of defiance. It cemented his legend as a man who could not be caged, a trickster who could outwit the most powerful state in Italy. This fame, this impossible legend, would be his greatest asset and his most dangerous liability. It made him a hero to the romantics and a target for the powerful. In Paris, the government of King Louis XV took note. A man with such ingenuity, such courage, and such a complete disregard for authority was not someone to be left to his own devices. He was someone to be used. In Paris, Casanova was no longer just an adventurer, he was a living legend. The story of his escape from the Piombi was the talk of every salon, a tale that grew more embellished with each telling. He was the man who had humbled the Venetian Republic, a symbol of individual will triumphing over state tyranny. But freedom, he soon discovered, has its price, and fame is a gilded cage. The French government, led by his patron, the Abbé de Bernis, saw in Casanova not a hero, but a perfect tool. His unique combination of intellect, linguistic skill, and utter fearlessness made him an ideal candidate for espionage. At the time, Europe was a chessboard of shifting alliances and simmering conflicts, a great game played by spies and diplomats in the shadows. The 7 Years' War was raging, and France needed every advantage it could get. Casanova was summoned to Versailles. He was offered a deal he could not refuse. In exchange for his continued freedom and a generous stipend, he would put his talents at the service of the king. His first official mission was a test. He was sent back to Dunkirk, a port city on the English Channel. His task was to pose as an Italian nobleman and assess the French naval preparations, specifically the strength of the fleet being assembled for a potential invasion of England. He was to report back not on the official numbers, but on the true state of the ships, the morale of the sailors, and the competence of the commanders. He performed flawlessly, his keen eye missing nothing, his charming demeanor disarming any suspicion. His report was a model of clarity and brutal honesty, earning him the trust of his new masters. His next mission was far more dangerous. He was dispatched to Holland, the banking center of the world, with a delicate financial objective: to sell French government bonds and secure a loan without alarming France's enemies, primarily the British, who had their own agents monitoring every transaction in Amsterdam. He operated in a world of whispers and clandestine meetings, using his charm to win the trust of powerful Dutch financiers, while simultaneously evading the surveillance of English spies. It was a high-wire act where a single misstep could lead to diplomatic incident, financial disaster, and his own quiet disappearance. He was a master of the double life, attending lavish parties and theatrical performances by night, while by day he decoded messages and planned his financial maneuvers. He came to relish the thrill, the constant proximity to danger. A man who gambles with his life is a man who truly feels alive, but he also began to see the ugly truth behind the gilded facade of international politics. He was a pawn, a disposable asset in a game played by kings and ministers who spoke of honor and glory but dealt in betrayal and death. He saw that the fates of nations were decided not on battlefields but in back rooms by men who would sacrifice thousands of lives for a slight advantage in trade routes. His work took him to England, the very heart of the enemy's territory. In London, his mission was to gauge the political will for continuing the war and to identify potential weaknesses in the British establishment. He moved through London society, from the rowdy coffee houses where political dissent was freely spoken to the opulent homes of the aristocracy. He seduced the mistresses of powerful men, not for love, but for the secrets they might let slip in a moment of passion. He was playing the most dangerous game of all, surrounded by enemies with no one to trust but himself. The constant deception began to take its toll. Who was he really? The Venetian adventurer? The French spy? The Italian nobleman? The mask was beginning to merge with his face. He found himself trapped, his life no longer his own. He served a master, the French state, that he did not respect, and engaged in work that, while exciting, felt hollow. He was a spy in a gilded cage, enjoying all the luxuries his position afforded him, but a prisoner nonetheless. His disillusionment grew. He longed for the days when he was his own master, when his schemes served his own ambition, not the cold, impersonal interests of a nation. He had traded his personal freedom for security and found it a poor bargain. As the war drew to a close, his usefulness as a spy began to wane. He had served France well, but he knew that in the world of espionage, loyalty is a temporary convenience. He needed a new stage, a new patron, one powerful enough to grant him the status and security he craved. His eyes turned eastward to the vast, mysterious Russian Empire and to its new ruler, a German princess who had seized the throne and styled herself as an enlightened despot, Catherine the Great. He decided to gamble everything on a journey to St. Petersburg, hoping to charm the philosopher on the throne and find a permanent place at her court. After years in the cynical, sophisticated web of French intelligence, Casanova sought a fresh start. He was tired of being a pawn and yearned to be a kingmaker, a trusted advisor to a truly great monarch. He set his sights on the most ambitious An intellectually formidable ruler of the age, Catherine the Great of Russia. He imagined himself dazzling the Empress with his wit, his progressive ideas, and his vast knowledge of European affairs. He envisioned a grand new act for himself, the enlightened Venetian, guiding the modernization of the vast Russian Empire. In 1764, he embarked on the arduous journey to St. Petersburg. The Russia he entered was a land of brutal contrasts. He saw the glittering European-style palaces of the capital rising from the frozen swamps, a testament to Peter the Great's iron will. But he also saw the crushing poverty of the serfs, the vast, unforgiving wilderness, and a society governed by a rigid, almost Asiatic form of despotism. It was a world far removed from the salons of Paris or the canals of Venice, and his usual tricks of charm and sophistication seemed to lose their power in the cold, clear Russian air. He finally secured an audience with the Empress herself. He had prepared meticulously, marshalling all his intellect and charm for the encounter. He found Catherine to be everything the rumors claimed: brilliant, sharp-witted, and utterly pragmatic. She listened patiently as he presented his grand schemes, reforms for the Russian calendar, proposals for a state-run trading company, critiques of the tax system. She engaged him in a lively philosophical debate, testing the depth of his knowledge. But Casanova felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Russian winter. Catherine's eyes were like ice. She was not a sentimental woman to be swayed by flattery or charm. She was a ruler who dealt in power and results, not in clever conversation. She saw through his performance, recognizing him for what he was, a brilliant but rootless adventurer seeking a patron. She listened, she was amused, but she was not impressed. An idea without an army is merely a dream, and Casanova had no army. His proposals were politely dismissed. He found the Russian court to be an impenetrable fortress of entrenched interests. The powerful nobles, led by Catherine's favorite, Grigory Orlov, viewed him as a foreign upstart and blocked his every move. His attempts to ingratiate himself with the Russian aristocracy were met with a mixture of suspicion and derision. His European wit was seen as frivolous, his elaborate manners as effeminate. He was a player in a game whose rules he did not understand. He lingered in Russia for nearly a year, his hopes slowly freezing to death. He traveled to Moscow, the ancient, brooding heart of the country, and saw a culture deeply resistant to the Western ideas he championed. He saw the profound religiosity of the people, the raw power of the military, and the unshakable foundations of an empire that did not need the advice of a wandering Venetian. His journey was not a complete failure. It was a profound education. It taught him the limits of his own power. He learned that the world was not just a stage for his own adventures, but a complex tapestry of cultures and histories that could not be easily manipulated. His charm, his intellect, his audacity, they were all useless against the monolithic power of the Russian state. What is a single man's wit against the inertia of an entire empire? Disheartened and nearly broke, he finally admitted defeat. He had gambled on Catherine and lost. He left Russia a humbler, more cynical man. His dream of finding a permanent, powerful patron was shattered. He was once again a wanderer, an exile, his fame now tinged with the faint scent of failure. He drifted south, through Poland and Germany, his reputation preceding him. He was still Casanova, the man who escaped the leads, but the magic was fading. He needed a new venture, a new country to conquer. He decided to head for Spain, a land of sunshine and old money. He was dangerously unaware that he was traveling from the cold pragmatism of an enlightened despot into the fiery embrace of a power far older and more unforgiving, the Holy Spanish Inquisition. His arrival in Spain in 1767 marked a descent into a different kind of darkness. After the cold, rational skepticism of Catherine the Great's court, the atmosphere in Madrid was suffocating. Spain, under King Charles III, was a nation caught between the creeping influence of the Enlightenment and the iron grip of the Catholic Church. The Spanish Inquisition, though past the peak of its power, still cast a long, terrifying shadow over the country. It was a place where an unguarded word, a forbidden book, or a foreign accent could lead to suspicion, arrest, and a secret trial. Casanova, the living embodiment of everything the Inquisition stood against, free thinking, libertinism, a disdain for religious dogma, was walking into the lion's den wearing a suit of raw meat. He immediately attracted the wrong kind of attention. His lavish lifestyle, his open association with actresses and other disreputable folk, and his tendency to engage in philosophical debates in public taverns made him a person of interest to the familiars of the Holy Office, the secret informants of the Inquisition. He was placed under surveillance. His mail was read, his acquaintances were questioned, his every move was chronicled in secret reports. Casanova, usually so adept at sensing danger, was blinded by his own arrogance. He underestimated the power and reach of this ancient institution. He saw it as a relic, a bogeyman from a bygone era. He failed to understand that in Spain, faith was not a matter of private conscience but of public order, and heresy was not a sin but a crime against the state. The pretext for his arrest when it came was almost laughably minor. He was found to be in possession of a prescribed book by a French philosopher. But the real reason was his reputation. He was Casanova. The name itself was an indictment. He was arrested and thrown into the prison of Buen Retiro. The experience was terrifyingly different from his time in the Piombi. In Venice, his enemy was the cold, impersonal bureaucracy of the state. In Spain, his enemy was religious fanaticism. His interrogators were not interested in his political connections. They were interested in the state of his soul. They questioned him about his beliefs, his morals, his association with known Freemasons and heretics. They accused him of being a corrupting influence, a devil sent to poison the pure faith of Spain. He realized that his usual weapons, wit, charm, logical argument, were useless here. Arguing with a fanatic is like trying to reason with a storm. He was no longer a player in a game of intellect. He was a heretic in a system designed to crush dissent. He was facing the prospect of a show trial and, if convicted, years in a monastic prison or even the ultimate penalty. Relaxation, to the secular arm, a euphemism for being burned at the stake. He had to use a different strategy. He feigned piety, professed his deep love for the Catholic faith, and presented himself as a victim of malicious slander. He wrote eloquent, groveling letters to powerful figures at court, invoking his connections and begging for mercy. He understood that his only hope was to transform his case from a religious matter into a political one. He managed to smuggle a letter to his most powerful contact, the Count of Aranda, a reform-minded minister of the king who was a quiet opponent of the Inquisition's overreach. Aranda intervened. He couldn't simply have Casanova released. That would be a direct challenge to the Holy Office, but he could pull strings. After 43 days of imprisonment and intense psychological pressure, Casanova was released, but on one condition. He was to be expelled from Spain immediately. He had survived, but he was deeply shaken. His encounter with the Inquisition was a confrontation with a force utterly alien to his worldview. It was a brutal reminder that the age of reason and enlightenment had not yet vanquished the ancient demons of fanaticism and intolerance. Escaping Spain with his life but little else, he was now more of an outcast than ever. The doors to the great courts of Europe seemed to be closing one by one. He was running out of countries, running out of patrons, and running out of time. He drifted towards Poland, a volatile and chaotic kingdom known as the Nobles' Republic. It was a place where a man of daring could still make a fortune or lose his life in the blink of an eye. It was the perfect stage for one last desperate gamble to reclaim his place in the world. Poland in 1766 was a powder keg. A weak king, Stanislaw August Poniatowski, a former lover of Catherine the Great, struggled to rule a country torn apart by powerful feuding noble families and the constant interference of neighboring powers, especially Russia. It was a land of immense wealth and desperate poverty, of lavish balls and brutal political violence. For Casanova, it was a land of opportunity. He arrived in Warsaw and quickly used his charm and his reputation to gain access to the king himself. King Stanislaw, a man of culture and enlightenment, was intrigued by the famous adventurer, and for a time, Casanova seemed poised to finally find the royal patronage he had sought for so long. But the Polish court was a snake pit of rivalries. Casanova's quick rise earned him the enmity of powerful figures, none more dangerous than Count Franciszek Ksawery Branicki, a wealthy and influential magnate with a notoriously short temper. Branicki was a staunch ally of the Russian faction and saw the worldly Casanova as a rival for the king's favor. The clash was inevitable. The spark that lit the fuse was, as it so often was in Casanova's life, a woman. Both men were rivals for the affections of a Venetian dancer named Teresa Casacci. A public quarrel over the dancer escalated quickly. Insults were exchanged. In the hyper-masculine culture of the Polish nobility, there was only one way to settle such a dispute. Branicki challenged Casanova to a duel. It was a foolish, reckless act. Branicki was one of the most powerful men in Poland. To injure or kill him would mean certain ruin. To refuse the duel would mean public disgrace and the end of any hope at court. Casanova was trapped by the code of honor he had so often manipulated for his own ends. He accepted. The duel was fought with pistols at dawn in a Warsaw park. It was a brutal, close-range affair. Both men fired simultaneously. Branicki's ball struck Casanova in the left hand, shattering the bone. Casanova's shot was more serious. His ball tore into Branicki's side, inflicting a grievous wound that was widely believed to be fatal. Casanova, bleeding profusely, managed to escape the scene with the help of his friends. As news spread that he had killed the great Count Branicki, Warsaw turned against him. Branicki's powerful family demanded vengeance. The king, his would-be patron, could no longer protect him. He was forced into hiding while a surgeon crudely operated on his mangled hand, saving it from amputation but leaving it scarred and partially crippled for life. By a miracle, Branicki survived, but the damage to Casanova's life was done. The duel had made him an outcast. The Polish court, and by extension every other major court in Europe, closed its doors to him forever. He had violated the unwritten rule. An adventurer may charm and swindle the nobility, but he must never draw their blood. He was forced to flee Poland, now a marked man with powerful enemies. The duel was the great turning point, the beginning of the end. He was 41 years old. His famous charm was beginning to fade, replaced by the bitterness of exile. His health was broken. His name, once a passport to high society, was now a liability. The fall from Olympus was swift and merciless. He began a long period of pathetic wandering across Europe, from city to city, trying to recapture his former glory. But he was a ghost of his former self. He was reduced to petty scams, borrowing money he couldn't repay, and relying on the charity of old acquaintances. The great adventurer had become a beggar. The man who had faced down the Inquisition and escaped the unescapable prison was now fleeing from creditors and bailiffs. The world had moved on. The age of Enlightenment, which had celebrated him as a symbol of individual freedom, was giving way to a new era of revolution and social upheaval. There was no place in this new world for an aging relic of the old regime. His pride, the very engine of his rise, had become the instrument of his destruction. He had reached for the sun and had been burned. His fall, a long, slow, agonizing descent into obscurity. He was now forced to turn to the darkest of arts, not the black magic the Inquisition had accused him of, but the cynical magic of pure deception. His descent was a long, humiliating slide into the margins of society. The man who had advised kings and financed states was now a ghost, haunting the gambling dens and second-rate inns of Europe. Exiled, aging, and with his famous looks fading, he found himself in a desperate struggle for survival. His intellect, once a tool for seducing empires, was now repurposed for a final, cynical act of manipulation. He turned to the occult, not because he believed in it, but because he believed in the gullibility of the rich. Alchemy, Rosicrucianism, Kabbalah, These were the new currencies in an era teetering between reason and superstition. He would become an alchemist of fortune, turning not lead into gold, but hope into cash. His masterpiece of deception, his last great performance, was the long and calculated manipulation of the Marquise d'Urf. She was an immensely wealthy, eccentric, and elderly French aristocrat, obsessed with esoteric knowledge and the quest for immortality. She had dabbled in alchemy for years, squandering a fortune on charlatans who promised to unlock the secrets of eternal life. Casanova saw her not as a person, but as his last, best chance for financial salvation. He presented himself to her not as an adventurer, but as a powerful adept, a master of the secret sciences who possessed the ultimate knowledge she sought. He didn't just promise her riches, he promised her rebirth. He concocted an elaborate and brilliant scam. He convinced the Marquise that through a complex magical ritual he could transfer her soul into the body of a newborn male infant, thus granting her the immortality and the male heir she craved. For years, he became her spiritual guide, her guru. He staged elaborate, theatrical rituals filled with incantations, astrological charts, and chemical theatrics. He bled her of enormous sums of money, all under the pretext of acquiring rare ingredients and making necessary preparations for the grand operation. It was a psychological duel of the highest order. He had to maintain the illusion constantly, fending off her doubts, answering her increasingly bizarre questions, and controlling her every hope and fear. He became a prisoner of his own lie, his life revolving around the whims of a deluded old woman. The king of confidence men had found his ultimate mark. This was not the charming seducer of his youth. This was a cold, calculating predator. He felt a measure of pity for the Marquise, but his own desperation overrode any sense of morality. He was fighting for his life, and she was simply a resource, the last great gold mine he could plunder before destitution claimed him completely. He took her across Europe, from Paris to Marseille to Geneva, always one step ahead of her suspicious relatives who were trying to have her declared mentally incompetent. The charade became more and more complex, more and more draining. He had to procure a young virgin to be the vessel for the magical conception, a process that involved more farcical rituals and more of the Marquise's money. But even this grand scam was destined to fail. The Marquise's health began to decline rapidly. The promised rebirth never materialized. Her faith in him finally began to waver. The psychological strain became too much for both of them. The great operation collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. The Marquise died, her fortune depleted, her dreams of immortality turned to dust. Casanova was left with nothing but a final, bitter taste of failure. He had played his last card and lost. The affair with the Marquise d'Urf cemented his reputation not as a romantic adventurer, but as a cruel and cynical swindler. There were no more doors left to open, no more wealthy patrons to charm. He was old, sick, and utterly alone. His brilliant mind, which had once grappled with Voltaire and schemed with ministers, was now just a repository of bitter memories. A final, unexpected offer of sanctuary came from a young nobleman he had once befriended, the Count von Waldstein. The Count, an enthusiast of the occult, offered Casanova a position as the librarian at his remote castle in Dux, Bohemia. It was an act of charity, a humiliating final chapter. The great Casanova, the man who had lived 100 lives, was to spend his final days cataloguing books in the middle of nowhere. The castle of Dux in Bohemia was a quiet, provincial prison. For Giacomo Casanova, it was the end of the world. After a life lived at the heart of European civilization, in the glittering capitals of Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, the provincial boredom of Dux was a kind of living death. He was 70 years old, his body racked with pain, his spirit crushed by a succession of failures. His job as librarian to Count Waldstein was a form of charity he found deeply humiliating. He was surrounded by the silent judging company of thousands of books, each one a testament to lives and ideas that seemed more real than his own fading existence. The castle staff, local bohemian servants, treated him with contempt. They saw him as a strange, irritable old foreigner, a parasite living off their master's generosity. They mocked his old-fashioned Venetian accent and his threadbare silk coats. He, in turn, seethed with impotent rage. This was the man who had seduced duchesses and debated with kings, now reduced to squabbling with cooks and stable hands over the quality of his soup. Loneliness was his constant companion. The Count was often away, and Casanova was left to wander the castle's cold halls, a ghost haunted by the memories of his past. He was forgotten by the world. The Europe he had known was gone, consumed by the fires of the French Revolution. The aristocrats who had been his patrons and his marks were now fleeing for their lives or facing the guillotine. He was an artifact of a dead era. In this abyss of despair, he found one last battlefield, one final adventure. If the world would not remember him, he would force it to. He would fight his last duel not with a pistol, but with a pen. His opponent was no longer a Polish count or a Venetian inquisitor. It was the ultimate enemy, oblivion. He began to write his memoirs. At first, it was a way to pass the endless, empty hours. But it soon became an obsession, a monumental undertaking. For 13 hours a day, the old man sat at his desk, his crippled hand furiously scribbling page after page. He wrote in French, the language of the culture he had so loved and conquered. He titled his work with characteristic grandiosity, Histoire de ma vie, the history of my life. The act of writing was an act of resurrection. As he wrote, the ghosts of his past came alive. He was young again in Venice, dueling in the fog. He was in Paris, dazzling the court with his lottery. He was on the roof of the Doge's palace, tasting the reign of freedom. He relived every triumph, every love affair, every narrow escape. It was a torturous process, filled with nostalgia, rage, and a desperate need for self-justification. He was writing not just for posterity, but for himself. He was putting the chaotic, contradictory pieces of his life into a coherent narrative, trying to find some meaning in it all. He was his own judge, jury, and defense attorney, arguing his case before the court of history. Was his life a meaningless series of hedonistic escapades, or was it a heroic quest for absolute freedom? He poured everything onto the page, his philosophical musings, his cynical observations on human nature, his detailed, often scandalous, accounts of his romantic conquests. He spared no one, least of all himself, depicting his own acts of cruelty and deception with a strange, detached honesty. His memory was prodigious, a vast archive of conversations, faces, and sensations from a life lived at maximum intensity. The manuscript grew into a mountain of paper, 12 volumes, over 3,500 pages. It was more than a memoir, it was a panoramic portrait of the 18th century, seen through the eyes of its most indefatigable traveller and observer. It was his last great performance, his final seduction. He was not just recording his life, he was creating it, shaping it into the legend he wanted the world to remember. In the quiet library of Dux, as his physical body withered away, an immortal version of himself was being born, on the page, ready to conquer a world he would never see. The final years in Dux were a slow, painful surrender to the indignities of old age. The vibrant energy that had propelled him across a continent was gone, replaced by the chronic pains and bitter resentments of a man who had outlived his own time. He wrote with a desperate urgency, as if trying to outrun death itself. He knew the manuscript was his only claim to immortality. It was the ark he was building to survive the coming flood of oblivion. He completed the bulk of his monumental work, a sprawling testament to a life lived without compromise. In the spring of 1798, his health failed completely. He died in Dux on June 4th at the age of 73. His last words were reportedly, "I have lived as a philosopher and I die as a Christian." It was perhaps his final irony. He left his colossal manuscript to a relative, and for decades it remained unpublished, a secret history locked away from the world. When a heavily censored and edited version finally appeared in the 1820s, it had the effect of a bombshell. The world was introduced not just to an adventurer, but to a new archetype. Casanova became a household name, a synonym for the serial seducer, the suave libertine. This, however, was a profound misreading of the man and his work. His memoirs were not a simple catalogue of conquests. They were a deep, often tragic, meditation on freedom, desire, and the human condition. He consciously constructed his own myth, mixing fact with fiction, polishing his victories and rationalizing his defeats. He was not just telling his story, he was creating a character, a legend that would be far more powerful than the flawed and complex man who had lived it. His greatest creation was never the lottery, nor his escape from prison. It was himself. The real Casanova was a man of staggering contradictions. He was a brilliant intellectual who often acted like a common thug. He was a man of great generosity and appalling cruelty. He was a champion of individual freedom who shamelessly exploited others for his own gain. He was the living embodiment of the Enlightenment, with its faith in reason and its celebration of the individual, but also its dark side, the ego run rampant, the intellect used as a weapon, and the pursuit of freedom degenerating into a lonely, selfish hedonism. The legend he created has long since overshadowed the man. We remember the lover, but forget the scholar, the spy, the financier, the philosopher. We remember the triumphs, but forget the long, bitter years of exile and the lonely death in a provincial castle. Perhaps that is how he wanted it. His entire life was a performance, and his memoirs were his final, perfect script. He understood that history forgets the complexities of men, but it remembers a good story. And Giacomo Casanova gave the world one of the greatest stories ever told. He remains an eternal mirror. In him, we see a reflection of our own secret desires for a life without limits, for absolute freedom, for the courage to be the sole author of our own destiny. But we also see the price of that freedom, the broken relationships, the loneliness, the inevitable decline. He stands as a timeless question. Was he a genius or a villain? A pioneer of personal liberty or a sociopathic parasite? He played the game of life with more daring and flair than almost anyone in history. But in the end, did he win? Or did he simply prove that a life lived only for oneself is the most magnificent prison of all? Casanova left us the story of his life, a hymn to freedom or a chronicle of egoism. He created his own myth, making the world argue about him for centuries. Now the choice is yours. Who was he really, a great player who lived by his own rules, or a brilliant deceiver who played with the fates of others? Write your answer in the comments. Your opinion is the final chapter of his story.